For days, the snow fell without pause. Caleb Shaw grew lethargic, his visits to the training grounds becoming infrequent. He had recently made the acquaintance of several financiers from the West Coast, acquiring a few luxury items, a Swiss timepiece, a rare single malt bourbon, all exquisite trifles. President James Lee was now a model of diligence, attending his morning briefs regardless of the cold and holding daily sessions with his senior advisor, Henry Sterling. He even offered a word or two of caution to Caleb about his apparent idleness, a surprising display of changed character. Caleb was pleased to see it, sending 2 prize bucks from a recent hunting trip to the White House as a gift. The president, still unnerved by a previous gift of alligator sausage, had no taste for game and promptly had the venison sent to Sterling. With the end-of-year ceremonies and the state dinner approaching, the entire capital was a hive of activity. The 6 major departments and the various federal agencies were overwhelmed. The intelligence services were short-staffed, and with many matters undecided, they had to consult the president directly. Lee, finding himself out of his depth, referred every question to Henry Sterling and the State Department for a final decision. Amidst this citywide flurry, the president noticed Caleb's lack of duties and tasked him with a significant responsibility, overseeing the complete audit of the 8 divisions' personnel rosters. Just like that, the security of the entire capital fell squarely into Caleb's hands. Unable to refuse, he was plunged into the relentless bustle. Julian Shin, accompanying Caleb on his rounds, inevitably crossed paths with the Federal Security Service units. One afternoon, Marcus Kane finished his patrol. Without even taking off his sidearm, he walked back toward the FSS briefing room and saw Julian standing outside. He rubbed his frozen, scarred face and strode forward. Julian turned his head, watching Kane's aggressive approach. He asked if the man was Shin 8. Kane stopped, his voice cold as he stated that General Shin was Julian's father. Julian wanted to know if Kane's business was with his father or with him. Kane said it was obviously with Julian. The general had been nothing but ash for years. Kane circled Julian, remarking on how comfortable life in the capital must be. He observed Julian's slender frame, comparing him to the pretty boys for hire on the East End, all soft and pampered. Julian recognized the hostility in his tone. Nearby, Corey remained silent, while inside the building, FSS agents craned their necks to watch the unfolding drama. Kane continued his appraisal, noting Julian's fine features, declaring that he would be a top earner in any high-class brothel. He wondered aloud why someone like that would trade a life of comfort to trail after their director in the wind and snow. Kane stopped, his gaze sharp, and continued his verbal assault. He recalled how 5 years ago, General Shin had licked the boots of the Northland's cavalry, barely saving the Central Plains from becoming a wasteland for the Sand Sea Coalition. He asked what part of their director Julian was planning to lick now, following in his father's footsteps. Kane claimed that the prostitutes behind their curtains all had specialized skills and demanded to know what talent Julian possessed that gave him the right to stand among men who had actually fought in a war. Julian smiled, asking if the commander thought he was unworthy and intended to confiscate his credentials and throw him out. Kane scoffed, saying it wouldn't require that much effort. He called Julian a dog at the FSS gates, claiming that even kicking him would be a compliment. Kane said he was only speaking to him out of respect for the director. He advised Julian that since he had become someone's thing, he should have the self-awareness not to act like a person. Julian countered that he wore the badge of the Federal Intelligence Bureau under the president's orders, serving the public interest, and that he was nobody's thing. He stated that if he was a dog at the FSS gates, then the agents themselves were not much different, both of them drawing a government salary to walk the streets of the capital. He suggested they should all find that self-awareness together. Kane gripped the handles of his dual blades, his eyes wide with fury as he demanded to know if Julian was comparing himself to real soldiers. He spat the name Shin Dog as an insult. Kane roared that he had been a ranking officer in the Lantern City Defense Force in the Central Plains. He took a sudden, menacing step forward, his voice filled with hatred. He recounted the disaster at the Blackstone River, telling Julian that his own brother had died in the Blackstone sinkhole. He asked if Julian could even imagine what that was like, seeing men impaled until they looked like hedgehogs. 40,000 men buried in a mass grave. 40,000. Julian's expression remained unchanged. Kane's voice grew thick with emotion. He said his parents were also in Lantern City. When the Sansi cavalry broke through, that traitor Shin ran, leaving the old, the weak, and the children to their fate. City after city was sacked. He described how his own sister was dragged for 2 miles by Sansi riders and then raped and murdered at the city gates. Yet here Julian was, living a life of ease, well-fed and well-clothed. Kane snarled that by spreading his legs for the right people, any crime could be forgiven. The cold wind whipped through the courtyard. Corey saw the situation escalating and knew it was too late to intervene. Kane grabbed Julian by the collar, his eyes red. He demanded to know how Julian dared to talk back when he was being reprimanded. He yelled that they were all privileged sons of the elite who had no idea how many people died in that war. No idea that even today, tens of thousands were still starving in the Central Plains. He asked if life in the capital was good. He screamed at Julian, asking how he could sleep so well, how he could live so well with powerful people always there to absolve him. He demanded to know how the deaths in the Central Plains would be settled. How? Julian gripped Kane's arm and, with a sudden violent twist, threw him to the ground. The impact was stunning, sending the onlookers stumbling back. Julian scooped up a handful of snow, rubbing it between his palms. He looked down at Kane. He asked how it should be settled. He said it should be settled with their own people. He declared that when the Sansi cavalry crossed the border, General Shin cowered for a full month between the Blackstone River and Lantern City. In that time, he said, real men like Kane should have crushed his windpipe and fortified the defenses themselves. Julian stood up. He told Kane that humiliating and hating him wouldn't change a thing. He said that if the world demanded a debt of blood for blood, then killing him would be a righteous act, a way to appease the public anger. He spat lightly in Kane's direction and laughed with pure malice. He told him to cut the crap. It was the Sansi cavalry who sacked the cities, the Sansi cavalry who slaughtered 40,000 soldiers. He told Kane that if he wanted to come after Julian Shin, he should first clean the piss the Sansi riders had rained down on his own head. His life was worthless, he said, not worth mourning. But he asked if his death would magically erase the debt owed by the coalition. Kane yelled at him to stop trying to absolve himself, shouting that it was his father who let the enemy in. Julian just told him to do it then. He drew a finger across his own neck. He begged him to be quick, to kill him. He said that with his death, the traitor Shin's line would be extinct. Kane lunged to his feet, drawing his twin blades and charging at Julian. Leo, who had just woken up, entered the courtyard and saw the scene, yelling for the tiger to stop, that he was supposed to be guarding him. But Kane was beyond hearing, his blades slicing through the air. Leo was about to rush in when Gus grabbed him by the collar, holding him back. Gus explained that Kane's entire family had died in the Central Plains and that you couldn't ask him to spare Julian Shin. Leo protested that it was all General Shin's fault and had nothing to do with Julian. Gus hesitated but said no more. Kane's blade slashed toward Julian's face. Julian spun, kicking Kane's wrist and deflecting the blow. Kane's arm went numb, and he flung the other blade. Just then, the flap of the briefing room tent was pushed aside. An Undersecretary of Defense, a Mr. Yang, stared wide-eyed as the blade flew toward him. Corey instinctively raised his arm to catch it, but Caleb Shaw was faster. With a flick of his own scabbard, he knocked the blade out of the air, sending it plunging into the snow-covered ground. The steel blade bit deep into the earth with such force that every FSS agent in the courtyard dropped to one knee in unison, pleading for the director's pardon. Caleb ignored them. He sheathed his own weapon, held the tent flap open for the stunned undersecretary, and offered an apologetic smile. He expressed his regret, blaming his own poor leadership for the alarming incident. Undersecretary Yang, eager to leave, stammered a few awkward pleasantries, hurried out of the courtyard, and climbed into his car, driving off without waiting for an escort. After seeing the man off, Caleb turned to face the kneeling agents. Corey, knowing his own failure, quickly spoke up, telling the director that it was his fault for his lack of supervision. Caleb's hand came down hard on his shoulder. He told Corey he'd seen quite a show. He tossed a piece of jerky to his gerfalcon, remarking that Asher wouldn't have made such a mistake. Corey's face went pale. Caleb didn't berate him in front of the others. Corey was his chief of security, his most trusted man, and Caleb wouldn't strip him of his authority by shaming him publicly. But the words struck Corey deeper than any public reprimand could. Corey and Asher were both top prospects handpicked by Caleb's father. Asher was steady and had earned numerous commendations serving with Caleb's older brother, a respected second-in-command who few dared to cross even in the capital. Corey had remained at the family estate in the Northlands until he was finally assigned to Caleb 5 years ago. He was cautious by nature, and his greatest fear was being seen as inferior to Asher. It was a rivalry between brothers from the same clan. Caleb's words today were not just they were a source of profound shame. Caleb addressed the kneeling men, his voice low. He recalled how, when he first took command 5 years ago, everyone said the FSS was a pack of undisciplined thugs who had no respect for their director. He stroked his gerfalcon, stating that he couldn't lead soldiers like that. He gave them a choice. Either shape up and follow the rules or pack their bags and get out. Kane, his chest heaving, spoke up defiantly. He agreed that in the past, they had all followed Caleb's orders, but questioned what Julian was. He asked if he could even be called a soldier. Kane argued that as a commander several ranks his senior, he was right to reprimand him. He declared that he earned his keep honestly and wouldn't bow and scrape before some pretty boy who sold his body. Caleb replied that Julian wore the badge of the FIB and was currently assigned to security detail. He told Kane that if he could rise to Caleb's position, then he could disrespect Julian all he wanted. That would be his prerogative. He looked down at him, asking if he still believed he had done nothing wrong. Kane, neck rigid, insisted he had not. In that case, Caleb said, there was no need to suffer any indignities. He told him to leave. Kane looked up, his expression one of disbelief. He asked if the director was firing him over this person. Caleb's voice became stone. He told him there were no personal grudges in the FSS, and to cut the melodramatic crap, he wasn't doing this for anyone. His voice dropped lower as he stated that in the FSS what he said was law. He asked what the point of calling him director was if Kane could just do as he pleased. He told him to take off the uniform, unbuckle the blades, and then he could go settle whatever blood feud he had. He added that if Kane could take Julian down in 3 moves, he, Caleb Shaw, would get on his knees and admit he was wrong. But as long as he wore the uniform and the badge of the FSS, he would only listen to him. He addressed the whole unit, his voice laced with scorn. He said they all enjoyed the show, that they had a lot of fun trampling on his authority. He called them spirited and full of guts, then asked what was the point of military discipline at all. He suggested they all just run off and become bandits. Wouldn't that be more fun? The men kept their heads down, not daring to speak. The gerfalcon, having finished its jerky, stared down at them. Caleb asked if they didn't usually like to call him a debauched and foolish leader. He declared that today he would live up to that reputation. He ordered them to confiscate Kane's badge and show him the door. The FSS agents cried out in unison for their director to calm his anger. Kane refused to admit fault. With trembling hands, he tore off his badge. He said he and the director had been like brothers, that he had been indebted to him for 5 years and would have given his life for him. But he asked what he had done wrong today. The director was hurting him, firing him, for the sake of a pretty face. Fine. Marcus Kane accepted it. With that, he placed his badge and helmet on the ground, bowed his head to Caleb 3 times with resounding thuds, then stood and stripped off his body armor. Clad only in his under-uniform, he looked at Julian Shin. He spat that he'd see how long someone who served with their body could last. He vowed that he would one day have his revenge on the coalition bastards, but told Julian he wouldn't escape either. Kane wiped his eyes and gave a salute to the men around him. He said farewell to his brothers, then turned and walked away. The room was kept warm by a charcoal brazier. Corey had been kneeling for nearly half an hour. Caleb sat in the main chair, reading a military manual. Outside the blinds, the other FSS commanders were still kneeling. A profound silence filled the space, inside and out. To establish command, one must first project an aura of unchallengeable authority. When Caleb took over the FSS 5 years prior, his first act was to assert his absolute power. In the years since, he had been fair in reward and punishment. He had not only ensured the FSS received every cent they were due, but had also supplemented their funds. He was generous with his men, yet the greatcoat he wore was a gift from his sister-in-law from 3 years ago. The recent autumn exercises had brought the FSS great prestige, outshining the regular 8 divisions and giving them a moment of glory. These men, long suppressed in the capital, who once had to act subserviently before the 8 divisions, now dared to swagger and shout orders at them. It was not a good sign. Success bred arrogance. Caleb needed an opportunity to remind the FSS of their place, and today Marcus Kane had provided it. Corey dared not look up. When Caleb tapped the table, he immediately rose to refill his tea. Once the cup was full, he knelt back down. Caleb didn't speak a word all night, and Corey knelt on the floor for the entire night. The unspoken words carried more weight, more guilt, than any spoken reprimand. The next morning, as Caleb dressed for his early brief, he told Corey that he didn't need to follow him today and that he should rest. Corey's legs were numb from kneeling. He supported himself on the floor and bowed his head, his voice hoarse as he addressed his boss. He had always called Caleb director, but this single word was filled with genuine emotion. Caleb did indeed pause, but did not turn back. Corey bowed his head again, asking his boss to punish him. Caleb gestured for the attendants to leave. Once they were alone, he turned sideways to look at Corey. He asked how he could punish a man who had done nothing wrong. Corey, sweat dripping from his brow into his eyes, admitted that he knew he was at fault. Caleb was silent for a moment before speaking. He mentioned that these past years, Asher had been on the frontier with his brother, his rank climbing steadily. In another 5 years, he would likely be given his own command. He reminded Corey that they were both chosen by his father as the best of the best. He asked how it was that Asher had achieved such honors while Corey was stuck waiting to die with a good-for-nothing like him. Corey's lips turned pale. He denied ever thinking such a thing, insisting that while the eldest son had his own merits, Caleb was his pillar, his entire world. He said Asher was his clan brother, and they rose and fell together. Caleb told him that was for the best. He stated that sibling rivalry and internal conflict were signs of a rot so deep that it would destroy itself without any outside help. While Corey was with him in the capital, Asher was taking care of things back home. He reminded him that Asher's sister had married a department official, and it was Corey who provided support for her family during holidays. To build a career, one could be competitive in spirit, but must be righteous in principle. Passion and integrity were the marks of a good man. He asked Corey what he was afraid of, what he was so anxious about when comparing himself to Asher. He said that Asher wouldn't have let yesterday's events unfold, because he would have had to consider the family's honor. Caleb pointed out that Corey, as the head of FSS security, had resorted to such petty games to win favor, allowing his own boss's honor to be trampled underfoot just for a moment of satisfaction. He accused Corey of knowing that Kane was from the Central Plains and deliberately assigning him to yesterday's detail precisely so he could vent his anger. He asked him, his voice low and sharp, if following him had reduced Corey to playing such games to command loyalty. He had sacrificed his boss's authority for a moment's gratification. Corey, filled with regret, lowered his head and said he had failed his boss. Caleb's voice was suddenly cold. He told Corey he had failed himself. He instructed him to think things through before returning to duty and said that Gus would accompany him for the next few days. Corey remained kneeling, stunned, as he watched Caleb lift the blinds and exit. Julian had finally gotten a full night's sleep. He now stood by the vehicle, breathing warmth into his hands, watching the Gerfalcon circle in the snowy sky. Caleb came out and got into the vehicle. Gus took the reins, looking over at Julian. Julian didn't look at him. He saw the door was ajar and Caleb was gesturing for him to get in. Julian suddenly felt the weight of every gaze in the courtyard. All the FSS agents who had been freezing all night, watching him. He smiled at Caleb and actually got in. Gus started the vehicle and it began to move. Caleb handed a rechargeable warmer to Julian. As Julian took it, Caleb brushed the back of his own hand against Julian's. He commented on how cold it was. Julian pushed Caleb's hand away with his fingers, leaned against the side of the car, and held the warmer. Caleb observed that he didn't seem very happy. Julian, warming his hands, said that he was. He looked at Caleb and added with a smile that the young master had stood up for him, and he was happy. Caleb clarified that the young master hadn't stood up for anyone. Julian conceded the point but then asked, now that the show of force was done, when the display of mercy would begin. He noted that his days as a security guard were numbered and told Caleb that if he wanted to make use of him, he had better be quick. Caleb watched him, silent. Julian tilted his chin up slightly in a relaxed gesture, exhaled, and after a moment, admitted that when it came to managing people, he was no match for Caleb. He remarked that Julian Shin was a useful target, a shield, a tool to intimidate tigers, and perhaps even a bed warmer. Such a multi-purpose tool was hard to find. He complimented Caleb on his cleverness. Outside, the city was noisy, but inside the car, the atmosphere grew heavy. They were only inches apart, yet it felt like a chasm separated them. When they arrived, Gus had the sense not to interrupt. Julian's hands were warm. He placed the hand warmer neatly back on the small table and commented that it was a shame. Caleb asked what was. Julian licked his teeth and said slowly that everyone thought Caleb was having the time of his life every night. But who would have guessed he was still such a disciplined gentleman? So professional that he hadn't even so much as taken a sip, let alone taken him. With that, he was about to open the door and get out, but Caleb suddenly hooked a finger into his belt. Caleb gave a playful smile and agreed. He said that since Julian was so eager for a contest in bed, he would oblige him. Julian replied that he didn't go for men with such a fierce look in their eyes. The door swung open, and he was gone. Caleb's fingertips were left empty. He wiggled them, a sense of unfinished business lingering. After the incident with Kane, the FSS became less ostentatious, tucking their tails and returning to their pre-exercise humility. Corey, in particular, became exceedingly cautious, no longer daring to turn a blind eye to any misbehavior. He had injured his foot years ago in the Northlands, and now, with the severe cold in the capital, it ached faintly every day on duty. One evening after dinner, Caleb tossed him a few jars of ointment. Corey opened them back in his quarters and found it was the same precious ointment Caleb's older brother had obtained from a renowned master years ago. He was struck by another wave of guilt and became even more diligent in his duties. Meanwhile, Marcus Kane, back at his home, quickly fell into hardship. His entire family was dead, but he had adopted 3 children from the Central Plains who depended on his salary. He wasn't married and had no wife to manage the household, so his monthly pay was always spent down to the last cent. Now, with no income, food was scarce, and the holidays were approaching. He was a veteran from Lantern City and had comrades in the capital, but he had always been the one helping others. Now that it was his turn to be in need, he couldn't bring himself to borrow money. He tightened his own belt to feed the children, but knew it wasn't a sustainable solution. Just as Kane was considering taking on work as a debt collector, Corey showed up at his door. Corey placed a stack of cash on the table. He said that, with the holidays coming, the director remembered he had 3 children at home. Kane turned his face away, sitting stiffly in his chair. He stated that since he was no longer with the FSS, he had no right to take their money. Corey told him he was being truly stubborn. He asked why he was still angry with the director. So many people were watching that day, and he had still attacked someone. He questioned where Kane's respect for the director had gone. He reminded him that a lack of discipline was a grave sin for a soldier, something Kane, as a former commander, should understand. Kane asked what else he could have done. He said that just seeing that Shin-8 brought back memories of his parents. Corey sighed, telling him he shouldn't have insulted the man so crudely, dragging the director into it as well. He reminded Kane of the director's temperament, asking how, after all these years, he could still be so reckless with his words. Kane ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Corey admitted his own fault, saying he knew Kane was impulsive and should have stopped him. He told him that a real man admits his faults and accepts his punishment, and that quitting wasn't the only way to be a hero. Kane felt a surge of grievance and bitterness. What else could he do? He had already turned in his badge. He had followed the director for 5 years, risked his life in the exercises. The FSS had finally earned some respect, and now he saw that fox charming his way in and out every day. He was afraid. He was truly afraid the director's future would be ruined by someone with a face like that. He was anxious. He hated him with a passion. He conceded that Leo was right, that Julian wasn't to blame. Everyone knew that. But who could stand it? It was his parents and brother who died, not some stray dog on the street. Corey remained silent. Kane stomped his foot heavily, roughly wiping his face. The scarred man's memories brought tears to his eyes. He choked out that it's one thing to dislike someone, to feel uneasy when they're near, but a hatred like this was different. He told Corey that in the year the Central Plains fell, everyone who survived had their families torn apart, barely escaping with their lives. Who had any pity for them? He pointed to the 3 children in his house, who were orphaned before they could even read, who had survived by clawing through the mud under the hooves of the Sandsea Cavalry. They were all just cheap lives. Corey patted his shoulder. Once Kane calmed down, he said that now that he was in the FSS, the director was his sky. He reminded Kane that 5 years ago, when the director was cleaning up the FSS and wanted to recruit displaced soldiers like them, the Department of Defense had disagreed. He asked if Kane remembered what the director had said. Kane's shoulders trembled slightly. Corey continued, asking if the reason Kane still wanted to be a soldier wasn't because of what the director said that day. Family feuds are not yet avenged, and the nation's shame is not yet cleansed. The FSS would one day ride out beyond the borders. Wouldn't slaying the enemy with his own hands be more satisfying than blaming others today? How had he forgotten all that over time? Kane said he would never dare to forget, that he hadn't forgotten for a single day. He would give his life for the director, just for that one day to come. Corey stood up and pushed the money toward Kane. He told him that real brothers don't hold grudges, that the director treated them like brothers, and that this money was from his own pocket. He instructed Kane to return to his old unit after the holidays, put on a junior officer's badge, and do his job properly. Overwhelmed with emotion, Kane saw Corey to the door. On his way back, Corey saw Julian Shin. The two exchanged nods under the covered walkway. When Corey lifted the flap to enter the main room, Julian knew his task was complete. Julian watched the falling snow with a sense of detachment. A wolf like that, so skilled at feigning, could make the false seem real and the real seem false. It was impossible to discern if his expressions showed joy or anger, if his actions were sincere or a performance. Before long, Corey came back out. He held the door flap open and nodded to Julian, telling him the director was waiting inside to have a meal with him. Julian turned and saw Caleb Shaw watching him. Fresh vegetables were a rarity in winter, and the crisp greens sold in the capital were exorbitantly priced. Thanks to a gift from President Lee, tonight's dinner table featured a dish of thinly sliced, crunchy cucumbers. a small, refreshing dish to cleanse the palate. Caleb ladled a bowl of hot soup and pushed it toward Julian. He told him he must be cold after standing outside for so long, and that he should warm up and have a light meal before resting. Julian wiped his hands and sat down. He quoted a saying that unsolicited kindness was a sign of either ill intent or thievery. He asked what the young master required of him. Caleb replied that there were many things required and suggested they eat while they talked. They both picked up their chopsticks. There was no one else in the room. 2 bowls of rice were quickly emptied, and the plate of cucumber was finished. Neither of them touched much of the meat dishes. Caleb, sipping his soup, mentioned that his mentor was coming to the capital for the holidays. He said that if Julian's mentor, Javier, was free, perhaps the 2 old men could meet. Julian put down his chopsticks and asked if this was a holiday greeting or a trap. He needed to be clear. Caleb assured him it was a holiday greeting. He explained that they were the last 2 of their family line and hadn't seen each other in many years. Julian agreed, saying he would prepare a generous gift and ask his mentor to make an appearance. Julian was full. As he stood up, Caleb told him he would be sleeping in his room again tonight. Julian looked back, smiled, and said that of course he wouldn't run away. He suggested they take turns bathing and that he would go first while Caleb finished his meal. With that, he lifted the curtain and went inside to wash up. Caleb had the servants clear the table. He stood by the window watching the snow fall outside. He turned his head and, through the hazy fabric of the inner curtain, saw Julian's silhouette. Julian removed his outer jacket, like peeling a rough husk to reveal the tender flesh within. As he bent his head to untie his belt, the curve of his neck glowed in the orange light, creating an urge to feel its smoothness again. The curtain acted as a frustrating barrier, amplifying and scattering the tantalizing desire, sending it coursing through Caleb's limbs, making him restless and stirring brutal thoughts. A man like Jade was one thing, but what intrigued Caleb most was Julian's desire. His eyes, his smile. He seemed to be constantly, perhaps unconsciously, radiating a certain sensuality. Come hold me. Come touch me. Come lose yourself in me. This desire was like a fine mist, not aggressive, but it seeped in unnoticed. Yet Julian himself seemed oblivious, maintaining a cool detachment that was the very opposite of sensuality, lightly casting aside this profound contradiction for others to grapple with. Caleb didn't want to think anymore. He keenly sensed that this particular hawk would not be so easily tamed. He had to be his own sole master. He couldn't tolerate being so easily provoked. Caleb turned back, closed the window, and went to the bathing chamber. They slept on opposite sides of the room again, separated by a bolster, their backs to each other, breathing evenly as if asleep. Caleb touched the worn leather bracelet on his wrist, his mind drifting to the past. This bracelet was not originally his. It had belonged to a man named Fong at Skylock Pass. When Fong died in battle, he left it to General Croft. Croft, wearing this bracelet, became a legend in the Battle of the Celestial Spire, where he killed his own wife with an arrow. The act turned his hair white overnight and broke his spirit. He had achieved fame, but the man within was dead. Croft could never again set foot on a battlefield. The hands that had won an unparalleled victory could no longer hold a bow with ease. As a child, Caleb had been with Croft and asked him how he could have shot his own wife. Croft, polishing his bowstring, had asked in return if Caleb truly wanted to be a general. Caleb had nodded. Croft told him never to marry. He explained that it wasn't terrible for a general to die in battle. What was terrible was that nearly every commander would face an impossible choice. What you want and what you must bear are 2 different things. Croft looked at his bow with a desolate expression, the prairie wind blowing through his white hair. He said with a hollow voice that he hoped Caleb would never be forced into such a desperate situation. When a man reaches that point, no matter which path he chooses, he dies. Caleb, leaning on a fence, asked why he had refused the titles and honors after saving tens of thousands at the Celestial Spire. Croft had smiled and said it was because he had died in that battle. It wasn't until he was a teenager that Caleb understood Croft's words. During the battle, Croft's wife was captured. He was faced with a choice: open the gates and surrender, or keep them closed and fight to the death. Croft chose neither. He rode out alone, drew his bow, and killed his beloved wife. Legend said it was the steadiest shot of his life, a perfect strike amidst thousands. That night, the rain fell in torrents. No one knew if he cried out in agony. No one knew when his hair turned white. When the sun rose and the enemy retreated, Croft stood on a field of white bones and collected his wife's body. From then on, the name Thunderfall Croft became famous. Even those who respected him cursed him behind his back. To be so ruthless was monstrous to ordinary people. They thought generals were just born cold and heartless. Caleb treasured the bracelet, but he also feared it. He was afraid that one day he too would be trapped in a dilemma, which was why he never spoke lightly of affection. Corey, who had been with him for so long, still didn't know his preferences. What wine he loved, what food he favored, what clothes he liked. Truth and falsehood were all mixed together, impossible to distinguish. The Northlands. Only those two words seemed to be his undeniable vulnerability. He had already tasted the bitterness of being controlled by desire. Why would he seek more trouble for himself? Caleb sat up silently and looked at Julian. He raised his hand. With a little more force, he could strangle this desire. Julian was trapped in a nightmare. His brow was furrowed, his temples slick with cold sweat, his back damp. Caleb leaned over him, seeing a Julian he had never seen before. Julian was drowning in a tide of blood, soaked through. He touched his own body and felt only blood. The dream repeated night after night. He thought he was going mad. Suddenly, Julian convulsed slightly. His tightly pressed lips parted, and he mumbled something through the sweat. He was so helpless. Caleb was jolted from his deep-seated apprehension by something else. He studied Julian, like a great beast observing its prey. Julian was not invincible. Beyond their unspoken tests and wariness lay a more unspoken shared suffering. Julian felt exhausted. He no longer cried out in his dreams, no longer clawed desperately at the bodies. He recognized the nightmare for what it was. He knew Ji-Mu was dead. Hurry up, a detached part of him urged. Just end it. He was brutally, grimly impatient, almost wishing for the blood to flow faster, for the snow to fall harder. How else could this nightmare display itself? He was no longer afraid. This skin and bone had been soaked rotten. He was a wild dog feasting on carrion. The filth and disgust were just proof that he was alive. Julian's eyes flew open. He shot a hand out, pressing it against Caleb's chest. In a few short moments, drenched in cold sweat, he calmly asked if Caleb couldn't sleep. Caleb's chest was hot. Through the thin fabric, he could feel the icy cold of Julian's palm. He said he had eaten too much. Julian remarked that if a more timid person had opened their eyes in the middle of the night to see someone looming over them, they would have been scared to death. Caleb, unfazed, claimed he had heard Julian calling his name and had to make sure he wasn't being cursed. Julian, his fingertips burning from Caleb's body heat, replied that he didn't curse him in his dreams and tried to pull his hand back. But Caleb pressed it firmly back against his chest, asking if he was cold. Julian, his temples still damp, smiled slightly and agreed that yes, he was very cold. He transformed back into that alluring figure, utterly indifferent as to whether Caleb was tempted or not. It was a skill he was born with, the mark of a villain. Caleb grasped his hand, pinning it above his head. In the dim light, he inhaled his scent and said that Julian knew exactly what he was thinking every night he slept in his bed. He told him that he had called him clever, but that Julian Shin was the truly clever one. Julian feigned helplessness, murmuring what was to be done. He said he hadn't done anything. Caleb leaned down, staring at him. He said that he wanted to. He repeated it, "I want to." Julian told him to find another way to kill him, that dying in bed was too pathetic. Caleb replied that he had changed his mind. He used his free hand to brush Julian's damp hair from his face, appraising him like a purchased jewel. He said he didn't want him to die. Julian advised him against biting his neck. Caleb let out a sigh, calling his name Lanshau, in a joking tone. He asked if Julian thought he would be spared if Caleb didn't bite. Julian looked at him. Caleb asked if teasing him was enjoyable. Julian confirmed that it was. He said that watching a little wolf, helpless and cornered, brought him great pleasure. Caleb replied that they could be even more pleased. His voice dropped. He asked what the matriarch Floris had promised him for her continued silence. He urged him to throw it away, telling him he would give him more. Julian smiled. He guessed that whatever Caleb was offering, it didn't include freedom. He told him that he never realized how transparent he was, how his desires were written all over his face. He asked if Caleb wanted to lock him up right now. Caleb said he wanted to forge a golden chain. He commented that it was a shame for such a neck to be bare. Julian, their breaths mingling, said that he also wanted to forge a golden chain, to put it around Caleb's neck and pull it once for every word he spoke. Caleb raised an eyebrow. He told him not to bother. He couldn't afford it with his meager salary. Their noses were almost touching. Caleb's bracelet pressed against Julian's wrist, leaving a red mark. Caleb began to say, "Since we've already..." Julian tilted his head up and kissed his lips. The soft touch was tinged with a cool mockery. He whispered, his eyes wild, asking if Caleb wanted to go crazy. He dared him. He challenged him to try and tear him apart, claiming he didn't care. The tightly wound string in Caleb snapped. The surging waves crashed forth. Spurred by the mockery and incitement, he pressed down hard, kissing him back as if he were biting him. Lust mingled with killing intent, hatred tangled with pity. Who between them was more hateful, who more pitiful? Their wet kisses tangled with tongues. Caleb kissed Julian, and Julian responded with all he had. The sounds of their mouths were obscene, desire incinerating two broken people. The hand gripping Julian's wrist suddenly released. Caleb pulled him up by the back, pressing their bodies together without a sliver of space. Hate each other. Stain each other with their own filth. Let even hatred become an unbreakable bond. Living like this was too painful, a nightly roar that only one could hear. Better to tear at each other, to become a bloody, brutal kind of support. This life was already rotten enough. His shirt was pushed up, his skin cool like moonlight. There were no caresses, only tearing. The thick night dissolved into a spring tide. Caleb cupped this water, struggling to push himself up from the waves of passion. In the space between breaths, he saw Julian's eyes. They held not a trace of warmth, of surrender. They merely reflected his own absurd actions. A pleasure like a knife's edge shot through Caleb. He needed Julian until he was warm, making the tide churn. He pulled Julian from the clouds into his arms, pressing down heavily, licking and biting wantonly. He bit the back of his neck as if tasting an intoxicating potion. The night was drenched, the sheets soaked with sweat. Limbs tangled, they rocked on the bed. Caleb, through the rushed collisions, gradually found his way to pleasure. He learned fast, surrendering in that soft cloud, only to rise again. He silently pressed against Julian's core, pressing until Julian swallowed with difficulty, his neck exposed and arched. Caleb kissed that neck, lifting Julian's knees. He was no longer a counterfeit gentleman. He was a mortal man, charging headfirst into the darkness. He made Julian forget the Blackstone sinkhole, and he made sure Julian would never forget this violent union. They had no lifelines. This night was their only escape from suffering, pleasure, a self-immolating fire. Julian reached for the headboard. Caleb pulled him back, locking him in his arms. Caleb whispered in his ear, daring him to run wild. reminding him that he had wanted to see him go crazy. He challenged him, asking if he was scared now. Julian's face was pressed against the sheets. His eyes closed as he panted. The expression of pain and overwhelmed endurance on his face was a mesmerizing temptation. How did he come to look like this? Caleb gripped his chin and kissed him, giving him no air, no rest, and in the throbbing, empty space, he drenched him completely. Julian was still trembling from the aftershocks when Caleb, without pausing, flipped him over and pushed inside him again. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the darkness was filled with suppressed gasps. Caleb, dripping with sweat, kissed Julian again and again. He didn't want to admit defeat, but he had already been conquered. Caleb fell asleep. His ferocity and anger softened in his features, replaced by a kind of boyish discontent. He held one of Julian's wrists, making them look as if they were huddling together for warmth in the winter night, turning the cruel kisses into a searing brand. The snow fell all night, light as willow catkins, without a sound. Just before dawn, Julian pulled his wrist free. Caleb's fingers followed, twitching in the sheets. Outside the door, Corey saw Julian emerge. Julian stated one word, training grounds. Corey nodded. As he stepped aside, he noticed the cut on Julian's lip. He started to speak, then stopped. Julian glanced at him, reading his thoughts perfectly. He said that the FIB reassignment orders should be coming down in a few days, and thanked him for his care during this time. Corey started to mention the other day's incident. Julian cut him off, saying there was no need to bring up things that were in the past. Today, Julian was unusually cold. He said that in the future, their paths would inevitably cross in the capital. He advised Corey that he would be acting with caution and that Corey should advise his FSS brothers to do the same. Corey paused, but Julian just smiled. He remarked that the FSS's current good fortune was hard-won, but fortunes turn, and who could say what the future held? Before Corey could reply, he had already swept his coat and departed. Leo brushed the snow from his shoulders, hanging upside down from a beam. Chewing on a pen, he frowned at Julian's retreating back. Corey, seeing him, asked what was wrong. Leo said that he thought Julian seemed a little sad today. Corey turned to see the corner of Julian's coat disappear. He replied that he wasn't so sure, that he had seen him smiling. Leo pulled a small notebook from his chest and, still hanging, scribbled a few notes. He mused that it was probably because of the fight he had with the young master last night. He'd heard it was quite a racket. Corey looked slightly embarrassed. He glanced up and called out to Gus, asking if he hadn't taught this kid any tact. He noted that the boy was 16 now and would already be married back in the Northlands. Gus didn't reply. Corey called up again, asking if he heard him. Leo pulled a wad of cotton from one of Gus's ears and shouted that Corey was calling him. Gus, startled, nearly slipped from his perch. He pushed Leo's face away and peered down, frowning. He asked what was going on. Corey pointed at Leo and told Gus to get rid of him, to sell him for this month's drinking money. Gus wrapped an arm around Leo's neck and said he wouldn't fetch much. A noise from inside silenced all three of them. A moment later, Caleb came out, pulling on a shirt. His eyes scanned the area, landing on Leo. He stated that his older brother would be arriving in the capital soon. As he spoke, he felt a slight pain on his lip and touched it with his tongue before quickly stopping. He instructed them not to report any trivial matters. Leo nodded vigorously. Caleb paused for a moment, then asked him why he was still there. Leo scratched his head in confusion, looking from Corey to Gus, and finally back to Caleb. He said that he was on duty today. Caleb asked where the person he was supposed to be watching was. Leo replied that he had left. Caleb said nothing. As Corey brought his horse, he swung himself into the saddle. Just before leaving, he pointed at Leo and ordered them to throw him out. Leo, not yet on his own horse, didn't have time to react before Corey and Gus grabbed him. He was terrified, clutching his little notebook, pleading for them not to. He insisted he hadn't done anything wrong lately. He was tossed out. Corey, after disposing of him, came forward and told his boss that his mentor should be arriving today. Without a word, Caleb spurred his horse and rode toward the city gates. Julian did not go to the training grounds. Instead, he went back through the snow to the old chapel. Javier hadn't seen him in a while. After letting him in, he hurried out to buy a rotisserie chicken. Professor Quinn hadn't seen him in a while either. He was bent over his desk, writing with a brush. Seeing Julian enter, he quickly put the brush down and greeted him. Julian sat down across from him. Quinn asked if the FIB orders were coming soon and where he hoped to be assigned. Julian replied that he was aiming for the presidential detail, to be close to the seat of power. Quinn nodded. He saw the cut on Julian's lip and changed the subject, asking if anything of note had happened recently. Julian was silent for a moment. He then stated that with Henry Sterling guiding the president, even a lost cause could be made to look competent. He explained that he had saved Caleb because, with the presidency already decided, killing him would have only destabilized the board. It wasn't the chaos he feared, but the loss of focus. Quinn looked at him. He asked if his time with Caleb had given him any new perspectives. Julian wiped a smudge of ink from his fingertip, taking a moment to think. He finally said that it was a great pity Caleb had been born after his older brother. If he could be kept in check his whole life, it would be fine. But if he couldn't be... Julian looked at Quinn, leaving the thought unfinished. But Quinn told him he still didn't understand. Julian was taken aback. Quinn stood and walked a few steps, looking out at the snow in the courtyard. He let out a long sigh and stated that Julian had killed Gillet. Julian stopped wiping his finger. Quinn's voice was uncharacteristically grave. He told Julian that they were trapped here, sustained by hatred, but they could not be killed by it. 5 years ago, Julian was incapable of such a ruthless act. Now he was capable and executed it flawlessly. He had taught Julian literature, but he did not want him to be controlled by hatred. One cannot find benevolence through killing. If he fell too deep, there would be no coming back. If he didn't conquer his inner demons, he would be forever trapped in his nightmares. Gillet deserved to die, and a single stroke was still death. He thought of their days back in Duan province and said he didn't want Julian to walk a cold, heartless path. Quinn continued, saying that Julian thought it was a pity Caleb was born after his brother, but he believed the opposite was true. He asked Julian to imagine if his own mentor, Jimu, had been the heir to the Northlands. If he had left Julian in the capital, would it have been only out of helplessness? Was there nothing else to it? A fine sword is forged through tempering. Caleb Shaw was that sword. He might not even realize it himself, but his brother had held high hopes for him for years, and the Northlands had never been stingy with praise for him. If he were a lost cause, indulging him would have been the kindest choice. But not only did his brother take him on campaigns, he let him lead his own troops. With no room for retreat, was sending his younger brother away truly just to make him suffer? 5 years ago in the Northlands, Caleb didn't know restraint. Now he has learned to control his arrogance. Everything taught can be superficial. Only what is learned through suffering becomes a true weapon. His brother was a good brother. The least regrettable thing about Caleb Shaw was being born after him. Quinn told Julian that this bond of brotherhood, which he should understand best, had become the thing he understood least. Quinn paused for a long time, his mood somber. He looked at Julian again, knelt down, and slowly patted the top of his head with his withered hand. He told him that his teacher had given him poetry and books, and a name, Lanzhou. A name that spoke of quiet grace and a vessel to cross a sea of suffering. A spirit that could hold rivers and a vision that could span oceans. He told Julian he was a good child, that killing was a simple act, that hatred was hard to dispel, but his heart must not change. He asked him, his voice full of pain, if he didn't still have his masters. Why did he have to push himself to such a desperate place? He urged him to speak of the pain of the last 5 years. Julian stared blankly at the professor. 25 years ago, the crown prince died. Quinn said he had hoped every day, cursed every night, wishing he could have taken that sword thrust, wishing he could have killed the enemy with his own hands. He had stewed in that hatred and become what he was now. He had become Julian's teacher. His voice broke slightly as he admitted that he wanted Julian to avenge his old grudge, but he couldn't let him become a blade that forgot its own identity. He was a person. He begged Julian not to forget the carefree days in Duan, that Jimu had died, but not because of him. It was fate, a life that couldn't be reclaimed. He told him that when he climbed out of the Blackstone sinkhole, he wasn't born to bear guilt, but to carry on the life of Jimu, the lives of those 40,000 soldiers. He lamented that Javier had been so careful, yet somehow still let Julian misunderstand himself, to blame the wrong person. Julian closed his eyes. He heard Jimu's call and remembered the scent of Caleb Shaw. In that moment, he finally understood why he was drawn to that scent. It was the clarity of the bright sun, a light that could let him escape the Blackstone sinkhole. Even for a moment, to forget the blood and the arrows, to forget the cold and the bodies. He couldn't remember the days in Duan anymore. They were too distant, like a memory from a past life. He couldn't even recall Jimu's smiling face. He had fallen into a nightmare, tormenting himself ceaselessly. Jimu was dead. Why wasn't he the one who died that day? His master's lack of blame was the greatest blame of all. The guilt was a life sentence he could not escape. He couldn't confess to Quinn that day after day. He had finally killed himself. Caleb Shaw was his mirror image, possessing everything he lacked. He observed Caleb, trying clumsily to imitate him, to make himself seem human. He couldn't tell anyone that the thing living inside this body was a monster, a killer. He was standing on the edge of an abyss. Under Professor Quinn's hand, Julian lowered his eyes, like a child listening to a lesson. He listened obediently, but in that instant, he realized he could no longer cry. A lump formed in his throat. He finally managed to offer a comforting reply, telling his teacher that he was right. 3 days later, the FIB reassignment order was issued. A commander from the 8 divisions, Han Chung, was appointed as the new FIB director. The 12 bureaus of the FIB were reorganized. Julian was transferred from a minor post to the presidential detail. Grant was promoted from section chief to bureau supervisor. Julian's new credentials bore the words presidential escort. The presidential detail was a prime assignment, close to the president, the easiest way to gain favor. Caleb Shaw, formerly the FSS director, was given the concurrent post of commander of the 8 divisions, solidifying his control over the capital's security. Since that night, he had welcomed General Croft and had been staying at the training grounds. He and Julian had not met again since Julian left the FSS residence. Corey, attending to Caleb, spoke in a low voice. He reported that Julian was originally slated for the stables division, but when the order came down, it had been changed to the presidential detail. Caleb was working on a 9-linked ring puzzle. His hands slowed. He said it just meant the man wasn't interested. Corey expressed his concern that being so close to the president would put him in greater danger, reminding Caleb that Henry Sterling had been one of the strongest voices advising the former emperor to have him executed. Caleb tossed the puzzle aside. He said that Julian was a debt collector on the edge of a knife, his mind not on serving the law. He pointed out that with Jile dead and Han Chang being an outsider from the 8 divisions, the FIB was now a leaderless territory. He asked Corey to consider what Julian might be planning by stepping in at this moment. Corey thought for a moment and said that if he succeeded, Caleb finished the thought. If he succeeded, then he would have claws. Corey did not speak rashly. After a moment, Caleb said that the FIB was the G family's domain, with Javier as his shield and old loyalties as his blade. Rising through the ranks would be child's play for him. Caleb noted that while they couldn't place their own people inside, they could stifle his opportunities. Promotions always required a pretext. If there was no trouble for him to solve near the president, he would be suppressed and unable to move. Since the FSS now had the heavy responsibility of citywide security, why would they need to trouble the FIB? Corey understood. Caleb took a sip of water, then thought for another moment. He told Corey to find a discreet place and set up a table for a meal. He said that he and Julian may have to fight, but they also had to eat. He pressed his lips together where he had been bitten. After all, they were technically fellow apprentices. Caleb scheduled the dinner before the state banquet. Corey delivered the invitation, but it was Grant who received it. Grant explained that Julian had been busy with his duties on the presidential detail and was unable to come, so he would accept it on his behalf. After taking the invitation and exchanging pleasantries with Corey, Grant remarked that the FSS was certainly enjoying its time in the sun, and that Deputy Corey must be busy as well. Corey replied that the director was swamped with paperwork, so his attendants couldn't claim to be busy. After drinking his tea, he said that Grant's recent promotion was a blessing in disguise and that his future was bright. He was the one truly in the sun. The two men exchanged veiled pleasantries, their words polite, trying to avoid open hostility. Recently, there had been friction between the FIB and the FSS, and a mutual dislike was brewing. After a fresh pot of tea was brought, Corey finally took his leave. Grant saw him to the door. Once he was gone, Julian emerged from an inner room. Grant handed him the invitation, saying it had come at a bad time and asked if he really had to go. Julian asked why not. He opened the invitation and saw Caleb's bold, unrestrained handwriting. Grant expressed his concern that Caleb was already showing signs of suppressing the FIB. Their assignments were being intercepted one by the FSS, and he was currently basking in the president's favor. If he wanted to do something now, Grant trailed off. What he wanted to do was all too obvious. Julian closed the invitation. He stated that Caleb wanted to crush the FIB, to make the capital his personal domain where the president could rely only on his FSS. He predicted, not surprisingly, that Caleb would deliver a few more kicks to the FIB while they were down. Grant agreed and said that in that case it was too risky to bring Javier to the dinner. Julian casually tossed the invitation on the table. He said that the matter concerned General Croft, and Caleb wouldn't play tricks with that. Grant was still uneasy. Julian's lip had healed. He put on his coat and said he was going out. Julian went out into the snow. It wasn't falling heavily today, but the wind was strong. He went to the East End and slipped into the Lotus Lounge, across from a well-known brothel. Harrison Vance had recently written some lyrics, which, set to music, were being sung by the girls on the East End and had become quite a sensation. His most clever innovation was hollowing out the space beneath the stage and filling it with open-mouthed copper urns. The stage itself was just a single layer of wooden planks. He had bought a new troupe of dancers from the West and, after much training, had them tie bells to their ankles. When they danced on stage, the sound of their wooden clogs and the ringing of the bells resonated through the copper urns, creating an ethereal, beautiful sound. As Julian arrived, one of his songs was being performed. Vance was lounging on a wicker chair on the third floor, eyes closed, listening with a fan in his hand. A servant girl, walking silently on the thick carpet in her stockinged feet, knelt outside the beaded curtain and whispered that he had a guest. Vance, without opening his eyes, closed his fan. The girl rose and held the curtain for Julian. Julian entered and saw another girl kneeling at Vance's feet, massaging his legs. Vance invited Julian to sit, his attention still focused on the music, gently tapping out the rhythm. The kneeling girl shuffled over on her knees, intending to remove Julian's shoes. Julian raised a hand to stop her and sat down in a chair. Only when the song ended did Vance sit up. Sipping his tea, he pointed at the girl with his fan and said that this one was new and clean. Julian didn't look. Vance, however, laughed. He looked Julian over and asked if he had really submitted to Caleb Shaw. He mockingly wondered if he was now keeping himself pure for him. Julian's dark hair contrasted with his pale features in the warm room, giving him a detached, almost otherworldly air. He told him to cut the chatter and get to the point. Vance opened his fan, his large body filling the wicker chair. He claimed they were brothers and that he had invited Julian over to relax, seeing how he must be suffering at Caleb's side. He lamented that Julian Shin was truly pitiful. First, he was kicked by Caleb and left with a lasting injury, and now he had to pretend to be friendly with him. He declared that Caleb was truly his unlucky star. Julian didn't shy away from it. He agreed with a sigh of resignation that he was indeed just that kind of scoundrel. Vance remarked that he didn't see Caleb showing any mercy to the FIB and teased that Julian's pillow talk hadn't been very effective. He called him a hopeless romantic. Julian accepted a hot towel from the girl and wiped his hands. He turned with a smile, the initial coolness in his eyes vanishing, replaced by his usual practiced charm. He commented that Vance was the one who had been pining for his own sister-in-law for years, sleeping with her once and falling hopelessly in love. He asked how his own fleeting affair with Caleb could possibly be called love. Vance clapped his hands and laughed. He exclaimed that was good, that was his Lanshow. He had been afraid that Caleb had found his weakness and made him forget that they were all in the same boat. He invited him to try a dish of wild vegetables sent by express from the coast, something not even available in the White House kitchen. They ate for a while. Vance noted that Caleb was a ruthless character. They hadn't paid him much mind before, but after he showed his teeth in the autumn exercises, there was no hiding him. So now he was playing hardball. He had taken over the military affairs of the 8 divisions but had given all the key positions to his own loyalists, leaving none of the 8 families with any real power. Yet he did it all so flawlessly on the surface that no one could find any fault. Vance asked if it wasn't infuriating, wasn't detestable. Julian noticed a dish of shredded cucumber on the table but didn't touch it. He commented that Caleb had risked everything at the South Hills hunting grounds, betting that the president would remember his debt and let him go. But that hope had been in vain, and he ended up being closely watched by the 6 departments instead. Now that he couldn't go back, his only option was to secure real military power in the capital. The FSS, compared to the 8 divisions, was like a firefly to the moon, useful but not that useful. Now that he had the upper hand, he naturally wouldn't let the opportunity slip. Before, there was Pan Rugi and the Eastern Agency to check his power, but with Pan's death, that faction had weakened. Now, in the entire capital, there really was no one who could stand up to Caleb Shaw. Vance took another bite and added that he wasn't as favored as he used to be either. The president was now listening to Henry Sterling, determined to be a great leader, and was less inclined to fool around with him. Julian finished his food. He said slowly that a man who has lived for over 20 years has his character set. If a few words could make him completely change his ways, there would be no difficulties left in the world. Vance paused, his chopsticks hovering. He asked if Julian meant. Julian put down his own chopsticks. He described Henry Sterling as the most upright of gentlemen, clear as water. When he met the current president, it was like water meeting hot oil. Sooner or later, it was bound to explode. He questioned why Silas Shwe, having reached his current position, wasn't willing to take another step forward. The cabinet needed talent, and he was certainly qualified. Vance was silent, pondering. Julian continued, asking how, with an external enemy at the gates, the 8 families could remain divided and act independently. He reminded Vance that he was now the head of his family, that fortunes had turned, and the opportunity was now in his hands. Was he going to let it pass? Vance also put down his chopsticks. He wiped sweat from his brow with a handkerchief and looked at Julian. He asked if Julian wanted him to unite the 8 families to deal with Caleb together. Julian replied that Caleb was only part of the problem. With the civil officials in favor, the universities were flourishing. In a few years, scholars from common backgrounds would be entering the government in droves. What would happen then to the privileged sons of the 8 families who were used to an easy life? If the commoners rose to power and a new elite emerged, the 8 families would no longer be the 8 families. Vance admitted that even so, it was too tricky. He pointed out that the Yao family, for one, would never agree. Yao Wenyu was Sterling's prize student, had traveled extensively, and had countless friends among the talented and worthy. He would never join their alliance. Julian smiled. He said it was the 8 families, but there was no rule that it had to be these 8 families. If the Yaos wouldn't join, they could be replaced. Vance was no longer eating. He pushed his chair back and paced the room. After a long moment, he turned to Julian. He asked what he could possibly do to stop Caleb. He reasoned that Caleb, dedicated to protecting the president, would not sit idly by. If it were just him, Vance wouldn't be afraid, but behind him stood the Northland's cavalry. With his older brother there, Caleb Shaw could not be touched or harmed. He was too difficult to deal with. Julian countered that while his brother was formidable, his influence was on the frontier. He leaned forward, his eyes hidden in shadow, and delivered the final push. He told Vance that the capital was their territory. A strong dragon, as the saying goes, cannot crush a local snake. There were plenty of ways to keep Caleb Shaw too busy to interfere. Vance, lost in thought, didn't even notice that Julian had said your territory. Not our. He asked what ways. Julian smiled silently. He said that Caleb's power depended entirely on the president's trust. They had been brothers for years, shared good times, and Caleb had saved his life, so for the moment nothing could be done. But friendship, he mused, was like autumn dew on a branch. A little bit of sun and it vanishes. Vance looked at Julian, remembering the rainy night and G-lay. The fine food he had just eaten churned in his stomach. He forced a smile, managing to hide his unease. He told Julian that since he had a plan, he should share it. After Julian left, Vance lay back down in the wicker chair and had the table cleared. He struggled to turn over, needing help. He felt inexplicably stuffy and had the windows opened. Silas Shue came out from the adjoining room. Vance sighed and asked if he had heard. He remarked that it was a good thing Julian was born the son of General Shin. If he ever gained real power, he would be even more difficult to deal with than Caleb. Silas poured some tea. He said that to use a person, one must use the right method. No one in the world was without desire. Julian Shin had his weaknesses too. As long as they could grasp them, even the fiercest dog was not to be feared. Vance tapped his forehead with his fan. He said they hadn't found them yet. He observed that Julian seemed cold even toward Caleb, the type to be completely detached after leaving the bed. Such a creature, he mused, could not be swayed by insults, flattery, or even threats. Silas sipped his tea and also smiled, a gentle, scholarly expression. He asked what the rush was. He suggested they do as Julian said. Whether it succeeded or failed, it would be Caleb's problem. When the time came, he said, Julian would surely reveal his true purpose. Julian left the lounge but did not hurry away. The madam greeted him, knowing only that he was Harrison Vance's esteemed guest. She asked what he was looking for, suggesting that trying was better than just looking. Julian surveyed the brightly dressed girls and asked if there were any young men. The madam turned and instructed someone to take the gentleman upstairs and bring a few young, clean-faced boys to serve him. Julian sat in the room for a moment before 3 young men entered. He glanced at them. They were all neat and clean. The madam was shrewd. Knowing she couldn't find anyone more handsome than Julian in the entire establishment, she had taken a different approach, selecting boys with delicate, pretty features. One of them moved to take off Julian's shoes. Julian shifted his foot slightly, and they all knelt, not daring to move again. Julian looked out the window. After a moment, he told them to take off their clothes. The 3 boys obediently began to undress. Halfway through, Julian looked at their pale shoulders, feeling nothing. He then looked at their hands. They were all delicate, like a girl's, as if they had never known hardship. They had no calluses, and they didn't wear bracelets. Julian sighed softly. He stood up and left without a word, leaving the 3 young men looking at each other in confusion. Leo, tailing Julian, saw him finally emerge from the Lotus Lounge and meticulously noted it down in his crumpled notebook. When he finished writing, he saw that Julian had already disappeared into the crowd. Not daring to be careless, Leo hurried after him, keeping a safe distance. Julian was not walking fast, but in the blink of an eye he vanished. Leo let out a small hey and rushed forward, only to be blocked by a burly man in a wide-brimmed hat. The moment he brushed against the man, he knew he was skilled. The street was crowded, and not wanting to cause a scene, Leo held back, losing Julian once again. He clenched his fist, a flicker of familiarity dawning on him from his brief contact with the burly man. As darkness fell, the snow grew heavier. The burly man, his hat pulled low, walked for a while before turning into a dead-end alley. Julian was standing behind him. He glanced at the man and asked what he wanted after following him for half a month. The man, keeping his hat low, laughed. He asked if Julian had noticed him that long ago. Julian acknowledged that his skill in concealing his presence was impressive, then asked if the man hadn't taught him a few tricks himself. He remarked that the man had disappeared after getting out of prison, leading their pursuers on a wild goose chase out of the capital, a truly painstaking effort. The man lifted his hat, revealing a stubbled face. Joel blew a stray lock of hair from his forehead. He asked if they really had to talk standing there, suggesting a tavern would be better. Julian watched him for a moment and said that a rabbit is hard to catch. He asked if he should call him Joel, or by his other name, Songyue. Joel said it was up to him. If he called him Joel, they had a certain rapport. If he called him Songyue, then Julian was his master. Julian asked how a man of his skill had come to serve his teacher. Joel gave a self-deprecating smile. He said he had no choice. He owed the professor his life and had to spend the rest of it repaying the debt. Julian remarked that things had gone smoothly on the night of the hunt, and that it must have been thanks to Joel's help. Joel replied that he was following Julian's lead. He noted that Julian had intended to kill the prince that night but hadn't expected Caleb to be so bold as to shove the man right in front of the FIB, playing everyone for a fool. But he complimented Julian on his quick thinking, managing to help Caleb in the process. Julian simply said that was the extent of his abilities. Joel brushed the snow from his shoulders. He declared that from now on, he was with Julian. He asked his new master to remember him if there was ever a feast, promising he was easier to keep than Caleb's guards. Julian casually tossed him a coin purse. He commented that Leo was young, and that Corey and Gus were the tough ones. Joel caught the purse. He remarked that Julian had figured out Caleb completely, while the man was still thinking about the life debt he owed him. Julian smiled. He said that Joel seemed to want to work for Caleb. Joel held up his hands in a gesture of innocence. He claimed to be a loyal and devoted guard, and that if Caleb Shaw were willing to pay a king's ransom for him, he would gladly go through fire and water for him. Julian retorted that, unfortunately, Caleb's circle was already full, and there was no place for him. Joel tilted his head and winked. He called his little master's tongue truly venomous. Julian adopted a look of mock flattery. Joel grinned, showing his teeth. He said that his words applied to both of them. 8 days later, Julian and Javier arrived as scheduled. Leo had clearly tattled, as Gus was sober today, standing outside the gate. He saw Joel trailing behind Julian. Leo immediately stood on his toes and whispered to Gus that it was him. That was the guy. Corey led Julian and Javier inside, while Joel was naturally expected to wait outside. But he showed no such inclination. As he stepped forward, Gus blocked his path. Gus's eyes were sharp as he looked at Joel's hat. He had heard that this man had blocked the kid's way the other day, and said that bullying a child wasn't very heroic. Leo puffed out his chest and echoed that it wasn't heroic at all. Joel burst out laughing. He took off his hat with a flourish. He said with a roguish grin that they were here for dinner tonight, not a fight. He claimed it was his first time meeting the young man and suggested that Gus had the wrong person. Leo cried out in protest, indignant that the man could say such a thing. He insisted he would never misidentify someone. Gus held Leo back and faced Joel. The two men of similar build stood face to face, almost touching. Gus said that today was not the day, but they would settle this later. Joel tugged at a lock of hair on his forehead and gave Gus a provocative smile. He said he was busy. After all, his master only had him, so he didn't have much free time to play with little brothers.
Gus spat coldly.
He told him to state his name, that they would have plenty of time to meet in the future. Joel put two fingers together and tapped Leo on the forehead. He introduced himself as Joey Moon, also known as Little Pine. Corey led Julian and Javier inward. The courtyard was deep. They passed through a covered walkway and a moon gate to find a courtyard full of red plum blossoms, a very elegant sight. Caleb Shaw was waiting under a tree. As Julian stepped in, their eyes met for a fleeting moment. An unspoken understanding passed between them before they both looked away. Caleb greeted Javier with a smile, apologizing for not meeting his honored guest at the gate. He informed him that food and drink were ready and that his own master had been waiting for a long time. Javier looked at Caleb and stopped him from bowing. He said that his master had left the family more than 20 years ago, and Caleb had since established his own path. They were not of the same school, so there was no need for such formalities. Caleb insisted that since they came from the same lineage, they were of the same school. He creded the family style with opening the door for him to learn from many others. He had long admired Javier's reputation, he said, so the bow was necessary. Caleb bowed, then led Javier inside. He didn't forget to turn his head and say to Julian that it had been a while since they had seen each other as well. Julian stepped through the door and replied with a smile that his senior was now a man of great power and must be busy. Caleb's reply was measured. He said that they were of the same school, and no matter how busy he was, he would always have time for him. Julian said he couldn't let his own matters interfere with official business, noting that he had been on light duty lately, which was already a sign of his senior's favor. Caleb held the door open. He said that if Julian wanted to be busy, he was welcome to come to him anytime. He would always be ready and waiting. The mention of being ready and waiting made the back of Julian's neck ache. The spot where he had been bitten seemed to burn again, so hot that even his smile faded. General Croft was dressed in a simple, wide-sleeved robe, his white hair tied in a knot. He looked neither like a scholar nor a famed general. Though he was a few years older than Javier, he appeared younger. If one had to describe him, he had a certain otherworldly air. The rumors that he had become a monk might not be unfounded. Croft turned and saw Javier. Javier, dressed in simple, rough clothes, his face disfigured, stood there. They looked at each other, and in an instant the past came rushing back. The laughter of their youth echoed in their ears, but the men before them were now white-haired. Caleb broke the silence. He said that the masters would dine inside, and he and Julian would wait outside. Javier, with a touch of sadness, turned to Julian and told him to keep his coat fastened, and to come inside if he got cold. Julian nodded. Croft told Caleb to take good care of his junior. Caleb agreed with a smile, and the two of them retreated. Outside, it was cold but a rare clear night. Julian descended the steps and saw that the red plum grove was deep, with small bridges crisscrossing within. The courtyard's elegance did not seem like Caleb's handiwork. Caleb, as if reading his mind, stood behind him. He pushed aside a plum branch, revealing a clear stream that wound through the garden. He said it was beautiful and expensive. He had bought the estate from the Yao family. Julian didn't turn around. He commented that Caleb was willing to spend. Caleb gently bumped his chest against Julian's back, reached up to cover the top of Julian's head with his hand, and whispered mischievously in his ear, his voice husky. He quoted a line of poetry, saying that red plums on snow and Lanzhou in fragrance were a sight worth 1,000 gold pieces. Julian dryly asked if he had mortgaged his pants. A genuine, slow smile spread across his face. Caleb admitted it had cost a bit, but that Yao Wenyu had sold it for a bargain. He paused, then added that Julian had run off quite quickly and had gone to great lengths to avoid him. Julian replied that it wasn't him avoiding Caleb, but rather a question of whether they had any important business that required a face-to-face meeting. Caleb smiled, a hint of ruthlessness in it. He asked if after sleeping with him, he didn't deserve to be properly cared for. Julian took a few steps forward, moving away from Caleb's chest. He turned to study him, silent. In the starlit night, surrounded by plum blossoms, they both finally began to process what had happened. Caleb realized that on that night, he had been grasping at water. Once it flowed away, it was truly gone. Julian held no lingering attachment. After their frantic tearing at each other, the searing passion had been buried by the night. The pleasure in Julian's arched neck and dazed eyes held no memory of Caleb Shaw. Caleb realized one thing with stark clarity. On that night, he was the only one who had been defeated by desire. Julian raised a finger to press down a plum branch. He spoke to Caleb in a bewitching tone, reminding him that he had warned him against biting his neck. Caleb gave a roguish smile. He argued that the pleasures of the bed were not something he could achieve alone. He told Julian that the biggest difference between them was desire. He accused Julian of being consumed by it, desperately trying to hide his ambition. A bite on the neck was just a minor stumble. He had pulled Caleb in, wanting to resist it, to defeat it, but in the end, he had still lost to it. Julian plucked a plum blossom, tore open the petals, and put them in his mouth. He told him, "But Caleb, I don't even have lust. How can you compete with me?" Caleb closed the distance between them, grabbing Julian's flower-holding hand. He leaned in close, his tone light and breezy. He asked what one time counted for. He suggested they have a few more rounds, since it wasn't satisfying. He pointed out that Julian couldn't use the girls at the Lotus Lounge and hadn't dared to touch the boys either. He had presented himself as a celibate, aloof saint, but he wasn't the one panting and moaning that night. Caleb brought Julian's hand to his lips, pressing it there dangerously. He sneered. He admitted he had lost to lust, but if Julian was so resolute, why had he bothered to test the waters with him at all? He told him, "Julian Shin, you are more afraid of losing to desire than I am." Inside, after a few rounds of drinks, the sense of distance had dissipated. Though they were not yet warm with each other, they could now converse over wine. Javier removed his scarf, revealing the burn scars on his neck, and took a sip of wine. Croft, seeing the marks, couldn't help but ask how he had ended up in such a state during the Sansi invasion of Duan province. Javier swirled his cup and laughed bitterly. He said General Shin retreated so fast that Duan didn't even last a day. The Sansi cavalry was too swift, and his own legs were not what they used to be. How could he have escaped? He had been prepared to die. At this, he thought of Hua Pingting. A lump formed in his throat. He turned his head and wiped his face, saying no more. Croft drained his cup. He declared that General Shin deserved to die. Javier replied with Yunchen that it wasn't just Shin who deserved it. He said that the defeat in the Central Plains was so strange, yet all the blame was placed on Shin alone, as if they were certain he wouldn't survive. Croft asked how, after being away from the capital for so long, he could be so sure Shin was a scapegoat. Javier explained that when Julian arrived in the capital 5 years ago, there was an attempt on his life in the federal prison. At that time, General Shin was already dead, yet someone still wanted to eliminate his entire line. Why? To silence them. Croft drank in silence. After a moment, he said that now, with everyone dead, a thorough investigation into the Central Plains disaster would be difficult. He asked if Javier's apprentice wanted to avenge General Shin. Javier was already feeling the effects of the alcohol. He had abstained for 5 years and had broken his abstinence tonight for Croft. Leaning on the table, he sneered. Avenge him? Why would Julian want to avenge General Shin? He accused Croft of being as pedantic as the rest of them. Did everyone with the surname Shin have to be guilty? Julian was grown now. He understood things, he could distinguish right from wrong. He and General Shin were only father and son by coincidence. Besides blood, they had no connection. He demanded to know what they were forcing him to do. General Shin was already dead. The so-called blood debt of the Central Plains. Shouldn't that be settled with the Sansi coalition? Javier suddenly smashed his cup, his chest heaving. A thorough investigation was not for anyone's sake, but to find out why he had to suffer like this. He reminded Croft that he was also a commander. Couldn't he see it? 5 years ago, someone orchestrated the fall of the Central Plains. 5 years later, they could do the same elsewhere. The Sansi cavalry had pursued them so relentlessly. Without an inside man, without maps, could they have done it? Croft sighed. He told his old friend to calm down. He explained that when his own apprentice had arrived in the Central Plains back then, the first thing he did was cut off the main route from there to Dan City, precisely to investigate where the Sansi tribes were getting their information. But the situation was critical. It was incredibly difficult. All the evidence pointed to Shin, and then Shin conveniently burned himself to death, leaving behind only an unfavored illegitimate son. How could that not arouse suspicion? Javier was silent for a moment. He said that the kick Croft's apprentice gave Julian nearly killed him. Croft drank again. He said he wouldn't make excuses, but asked his friend to hear him out. They each had their own perspectives, their own goals. Javier sneered, asking if a few words were supposed to make it all go away. Croft didn't say more. He turned his empty cup over and called out to the door. "Caleb." The door opened immediately. With one hand, Croft poured wine, and with the other he tossed the cup. He told Caleb to apologize to his master and his junior. Javier caught the cup on the tip of his chopstick. He said that they were the ones who were outmatched that day, and that Julian should be the one to offer this drink. As he spoke, the cup flew through the air toward Julian. Caleb intercepted it mid-air. He told Julian not to argue with his senior over this. Julian kicked Caleb's arm, deflecting it. The cup wobbled and began to fall. He said that a master's command was hard to disobey and asked his senior to let him. Their hands brushed past each other. Caleb pushed Julian's arm back. The cup was about to hit the floor when Julian flicked it back up with his foot. As they moved, the air seemed to hum. The cup rose and fell between them, yet not a single drop of wine was spilled. Javier, his chopstick still steady, ate a few bites of cold appetizers. He remarked that this was not the G family's style. Croft watched the two of them. He said it was the Shaw family's technique, like a hawk seizing its prey. Once caught, it was hard to escape. He called out to Julian to attack Caleb's lower body and throw him off balance. Julian immediately withdrew his hand, took a step back, and unleashed a powerful kick. Caleb dodged slightly. He wanted to say something to Julian, but in front of their masters, he held his tongue. As he blocked, he grabbed Julian's ankle. Using his body to shield the movement, he ran his hand up the curve of Julian's calf, pulling him gently closer. He said with a serious face that Julian was too ruthless, that his kick left him with no way to defend himself. The touch threw Julian off balance as he reached for the cup. Caleb, unhurried, waited until he had it, then suddenly threw a punch straight at his face. It was the G family fist. Javier paused, his chopsticks hovering. He restrained himself for a moment before admitting that it was no wonder Julian praised him. The man's body was perfectly suited for it. The punch was flawless. Julian, holding the cup in one hand, couldn't block it directly. He leaned back sharply. The force of the punch grazed his temple. Before he could straighten up, Caleb stepped in. The punch flowed downward, flicking at Julian's collar and dislodging the broken plum blossom Julian had bitten earlier. Caleb's eyes glinted with mischief. He had scored a hit. He popped the half-blossom into his mouth. Julian tried to stand, but Caleb blocked him. He looked up and said quickly that the wine was spilling. Julian, startled, looked up. Caleb seized his hand, his thumb sliding up the inside of his wrist. Using Julian's own hand, he downed the wine in one gulp. He stepped back immediately, acting like a perfect gentleman. He thanked his junior for the wine, remarking that it had a fragrant aftertaste. The inside of Julian's wrist still burned where he had been touched. He stood up, flicked his sleeve, bowed, and placed the cup back on the table. Javier, unaware of the undercurrents between them, saw this and commented that blending various styles was difficult, but Caleb was a good teacher. Croft replied that he still had a long way to go, and that Julian, having specialized in the G family's internal methods, possessed true discipline. The two masters poured themselves another drink, and Caleb and Julian retreated outside again. As soon as the door closed, Caleb grabbed Julian's arm. He said that the wine wouldn't be finished tonight, that it was cold outside, and they should sit in his room. Through the corridor to the north was the Yao family's original study. To keep the books from being damaged by moisture, a heated floor system had been installed. The books had not yet been moved out, and the four-story, open-shelf bookcases were filled with antiques and scrolls. Caleb took off his coat, propped his leg up on the corner of the desk, and started flipping through a book. He said the courtyard was originally built by the old master Yao and contained many treasures. Yao Wenyu had no interest in them, so they had just been sitting here. Julian, after wiping his hands clean, touched a book on the shelf. The Yao family loved books. The old master had categorized them and arranged them neatly. Even after all this time, the pages were clean. Caleb must have had someone take good care of them after he took over. There wasn't a speck of dust. The two of them occupied opposite sides of the room, neither speaking. Julian noticed a volume on geography that contained a map of the Wild Goose Mountains. He opened it and, as expected, found a topographical map of the area. The mountains were divided into an eastern and western range. The western range connected to the Sunset Pass and Shenzhen, blocking off Huaizhou, and had been the old dynasty's border. Later, Caleb's father expanded the territory, pushing the border all the way to the eastern range, creating the current shape of the Northlands. Julian flipped further and saw a detailed description of the northeast supply route. The capital managed the nation's granaries. Military grain was mostly sourced from the western provinces. Transport to the north and east couldn't be done by water, so dedicated supply roads had been built. The east was more complex, but the northeast supply route to the Northlands was very clear. Grain was transported from the coast to a port, then to the capital, from the capital to Shenzhen, and from there, it could be transported by horse along the northeast supply route, directly to the Northlands. This route was a vital lifeline for the Northlands, heavily guarded by their cavalry. Even the president himself couldn't pass without a transit permit from Caleb's brother. For years, no matter how fierce the fighting on the border, the defenses of the northeast supply route had been impregnable, never allowing the Sansi cavalry to get close. In fact, 5 years ago, when the Central Plains fell, the reason Caleb's brother was able to mobilize his troops so quickly southward was that the supply route ran just northwest of Suzhou, giving him the strategic advantage to deploy immediately. Caleb had come over at some point. He followed Julian's finger down the map. He asked if he was also interested in military strategy. Julian replied without thinking that he was not. Caleb said the young master would teach him. He took Julian's hand, guiding his finger to the Blackstone River on the far east. He pointed out that this was the easternmost defensive line in the central region. Beyond it was the Sansi Desert. He found it interesting that, for the longest time, the Sansi tribes had only dared to attack the border counties. Julian followed his finger southeast of the Celestial Spire. There, adjacent to the Great Desert, was the border region, the dynasty's only vulnerable point. It was a matter of geography. To the north, the Celestial Spire stood as a barrier. To the south, Skylock Pass blocked the way. Only the stretch of borderland was a weakness that couldn't be defended by terrain. Caleb leaned closer, his focus on the map. He asked if Julian knew Luke Grant's moniker. He was called Desert Torch because the Grant family guarded the beacon towers in the vast desert. The Sansi cavalry was treacherous and favored night raids. In every engagement, Grant had to light the beacons. The Border Defense Force was the nation's best infantry for night combat, specializing in ambushes. Caleb seemed pleased as he spoke. He held Julian's finger and tapped the border region. He explained that among the 4 great generals, his master was the best at defense, a necessity of the terrain at the Celestial Spire, which didn't require offensive campaigns. He told Julian not to underestimate the border region. Grant was the master of wars of attrition, even better than his own brother or General Thorne. Julian noted that the border region had no cavalry. Caleb smiled, a rare, relaxed expression. He said Grant didn't need any. His soldiers were the bane of all cavalry. The Grant family had defended the desert for generations. The climate was harsh, the land barren, and they were truly poor, unable to afford horses. But wars had to be fought, and so the Grant family developed tactics specifically to counter cavalry. Julian looked back at the map. He asked if what Caleb found interesting was that 5 years ago, the Sansi cavalry had changed their strategy and launched a fierce attack on the Blackstone River line, which was highly unusual. Caleb confirmed it. He paused, as if about to turn his bracelet out of habit. But since he was holding Julian's hand, he squeezed it unconsciously instead. He told Julian that he first needed to understand that the Sansi coalition was a collective term. They lived in the desert, and initially there were more than 12 tribes. The Huyen tribe, which traded with the Northlands, was a smaller tribe that had been driven from fertile lands by others and had sought refuge with the dynasty. The current 12 tribes had varying strengths and no single leader, which was why they could never negotiate and could only fight. In reality, every battle was a devastating blow to the Sansi people themselves. The strongest tribe, the Vipers, was in the north, specifically to counter the Northlands cavalry. In the south, the swiftest, the coursers, dealt with the border defense. This was a fixed pattern formed through long-term conflict. But 5 years ago, both the Vipers and the coursers converged on the central region and, without any, struck the Blackstone River line. Caleb paused. This situation pointed to only one possibility. Julian said that they were confident, certain that the Central Plains couldn't hold them off and that the Northlands and the border region couldn't provide aid in time. Caleb agreed. That was why the rumors of General Shin's collusion with the enemy started. A deep incursion was a risky move. It wasn't easy for them to sustain themselves by pillaging in an unfamiliar environment. They were accustomed to the open desert. Urban warfare was like fighting with their hands tied. And the closer they got to the capital, the more obvious their intentions became. Attacking the capital wasn't a good choice. It was the heart of the dynasty. If they stayed too long, they would be caught in a 3-pronged pincer movement by the Northlands cavalry, the Eastern Command, and the 8 divisions. Julian lowered his gaze. He said he had never believed the Sansi cavalry's goal was the capital. Caleb praised him for being too smart. He slid Julian's hand across the entire map, pointing to the westernmost province. He believed their real target was there. It was a coastal province with 2 major ports and 3 major grain reserves. All military supplies for the Northlands, the capital, and the East came from there. Once they entered its borders, they wouldn't even need to conquer cities. They would have a stranglehold on all 3 regions. Julian mused that without an inside man, this would be pure fantasy. The Central Plains and the Western Province formed a straight east-west line. Crossing the Central Plains was the shortest route. General Shin had opened the door for them, giving them the courage and supplies to push deeper. Without the northeast supply route, Caleb's brother would have been at least 7 days late in deploying his troops. In 7 days, if the 8 divisions hadn't held, the Sansi cavalry would have reached the port. Caleb said this was one of the reasons the Northlands was so furious. There was no room for treachery on the battlefield. They could forgive General Shin for his defeat, but they would never forgive him for this backstabbing. Julian suddenly turned his head, his face inches from Caleb's. Caleb didn't intend to let go. He asked what was wrong. Julian showed a strange smile. He said that if General Shin colluded with the enemy, and the Sansi tribes wanted to attack the Western Province, where did he get the military maps for that region? Caleb replied that the Department of Defense had them. Money could make ghosts turn millstones. They could be bought with a heavy bribe. Julian pressed, saying that in that case it could have been someone other than General Shin. Caleb lowered his eyes. He conceded the point but argued that the person directly responsible for the front-line's success or failure was Shin. His lowered gaze made him look surprisingly tender. The light from before hadn't faded, shimmering in his eyes like fireflies in the night. Julian watched him for a moment. He said there had been no personnel changes in the Department of Defense for years. Caleb told him to investigate if he wanted to. He wouldn't stand in his way. Julian looked back at the book. He said that of course he wouldn't because he wanted to investigate it too. He noted that the Flores family was the most likely suspect, but General Shin was already a tainted blade. There were 1,000 simpler ways to deal with him. To make such a big move was risky and could easily leave traces. Caleb smiled. He mentioned that Julian had killed Jilei, who must have told him a lot. He asked why he was being so secretive. He suggested they share their information. Julian slowly pulled his hand back. He said the value was not the same. He knew everything Caleb had said, but Caleb only knew what he chose to reveal. Caleb thought for a moment. He proposed a trade 1-for-1. Julian agreed, then told him to move first. Caleb, using his height advantage, trapped him against the bookshelf. He casually flipped through a book. He said Julian didn't know the rules. Secrets had to be whispered. Julian leaned forward. He said whispering didn't mean pressing against each other. Caleb put the book back, leaning on his arm. He smiled and asked what if there were ears in the walls. After all, he had just bought the place and wasn't familiar with it yet. It was better to be cautious. Julian looked at the books. He called Caleb a real bastard. Caleb agreed, asking what he was going to do about it. He said he would start. Julian waited for a moment but heard nothing. He turned his head and saw Caleb was still looking at him. Their breaths mingled. Caleb finally spoke. He asked if Julian knew that General Shin didn't die by suicide, that the fire at his residence was set by the FIB, and the man who led the team was Jilei. He asked if Julian already knew that. Julian calmly replied that he did, and that it was no secret. Caleb then asked if he knew the real reason for the fall of Duan province. Julian couldn't look away, couldn't even think slowly. If he couldn't keep up with Caleb's train of thought, he would easily fall into his trap. He said that when the Blackstone River was attacked, General Shun ordered the Duan Defense Force to retreat, leaving his eldest son, Shinjoji, to reinforce the river. Shinjoji was cut from the same cloth as his father. He abandoned the soldiers at the river and fled with his personal guards, only to be caught and killed on the main road by the Sansi cavalry that same day. With his death, morale at the Blackstone River collapsed. After the soldiers were massacred, there were no troops left before Duan. Caleb said he was correct, but that he was missing one detail. Before Shinjoji died, he and his father worked together to strangle the commander of the Duan Defense Force, Dan Tai Long. The name made Julian frown. Dan Tai Long, Dan Tai Tiger. No wonder Kane had said his own brother was in the Blackstone sinkhole. He asked if they had strangled him. Caleb explained that Dan Tai Long had insisted on meeting the enemy head-on and had repeatedly contradicted General Shun in public. When the retreat order was given, he refused to obey. Shun pretended to offer him wine as an apology, and after he was drunk, he and his son strangled him in his room. Caleb paused. He said that the tiger didn't know. He thought his brother had died in battle. That was his first piece of information. It was Julian's turn. Julian quickly collected his thoughts. He said General Shin was involved in the succession struggle and had killed for the Empress Dowager, after which he was kept under her strict control. Sensing danger, he bribed Panrugi and went to the Central Plains. Caleb commented that a watchdog couldn't be easily removed. Under normal circumstances, the Flores family wouldn't have chosen such a risky way to deal with Shin. It brought no benefit to the Dowager, who was effectively ruling the country. The cost of the war had already exceeded the National Treasury's reserves. She wanted to remain the power behind the throne. This would have hurt her. General Shin wasn't worth the price. Julian nodded slightly. He agreed that what Ji Lei said might not be entirely true, because he was just a pawn. To investigate this, they had to start with the Department of Defense. Could go up or down from there. Caleb said he would investigate up, and Julian could investigate down. Julian noted that up and down were connected, inseparable. As he said this, he realized Caleb was teasing him. He feigned ignorance and continued to look at the books. Caleb seemed to smile. He moved aside and said, "Sit." The room was warm. Caleb was wearing a grand red robe embroidered with lions, the formal attire of his rank. He must have come here directly from the White House without changing. Sitting in the chair, his handsome features were more prominent, stripped of their usual flippancy. They sat across from each other. Caleb watched Julian read. He made no effort to hide his interest now. His gaze roamed from Julian's neck to his hands. He was no longer focused on one spot. He wanted to see all of him. When Julian's fingers extended to turn a page, they would curl slightly. It reminded Caleb of other times, when Julian's fingers would curl just like that, clutching the sheets, damp with sweat, rocking with the waves of passion. Julian felt as if his fingers were still being held and played with. A sudden restlessness rose in him. He closed the book and looked directly at Caleb. Caleb asked, Julian's fingers curled slightly. He traced the line of his lips and said he was afraid the FSS was too busy with its current duties to have time for other investigations. Caleb turned his bracelet. He said the rush was temporary, and if the FIB had free time, they could always help the FSS out. Julian leaned back in his chair. He retorted that he was just a common man, without rank or favor from the president. How could he possibly influence the FIB? He noted that the FSS was responsible for both the capital security and private investigations for the president. The director must be very busy and careful. It couldn't be easy. Caleb had suppressed the FIB, and now he was indeed busy. He understood in Julian's words. He laced his fingers together and placed them on the table opposite Julian. He stated with certainty, "You're going to make trouble for me." Julian replied gently that it was tit for tat. Caleb had intercepted all his assignments, leaving him with free time. Naturally, he had to thank him properly. Caleb suggested there were many ways to show gratitude, and why not choose one that was pleasant for both of them? He said it seemed Julian had friends in the 6 departments. Julian stated that having friends in the government was better than having money at home. His friends had told him a few things that he thought Caleb might be interested in. Caleb stared at him, saying he was all ears, but Julian looked around the study. He said it was a pity he had yet to meet the famed pristine Jade Yao Wenyu. He asked if Caleb's relationship with him was good. Caleb replied that they were acquaintances, not as close as he and Julian. Julian remarked that the Yao family was in decline but still one of the 8 families, which must cause some resentment. Yao Wenyu was Henry Sterling's protege but had not entered politics. This was like casting aside his weapon, leaving him vulnerable. Caleb countered that even if the Yao family appeared to be in decline, the prestige accumulated over 3 generations was still there. Yao Wenyu might be a man of integrity, but he was certainly not a fool. He asked who would want to cause trouble for the Yao family. Julian feigned a thoughtful expression. He said he wouldn't know. Caleb fell silent, but his mind worked quickly. He said that Julian was not such a generous person. Providing him with information like this was unsettling. Julian replied that they were investigating a case together, and he would certainly help where he could. He said that seeing Caleb's good relationship with the Yao family today had simply reminded him of something. He pointed out that the 8 families had stood for a long time. Seeing Caleb's rising power, it was only natural for them to want to do something. If the Yao family refused to go along with them, they would inevitably become a target. Caleb had taken over the 8 divisions, disrupting the military authority of the 8 families. The divisions had always been their power base in the capital. Losing one position was nothing, They had sons to replace them. But losing control of the divisions meant being at someone else's mercy. It was one thing for them to check and balance each other. It was another for them to be controlled by Caleb Shaw. The old saying was that what is long divided must unite, and what is long united must divide. Now, Caleb Shaw was the common enemy that could reunite the 8 families. Julian was right, but Caleb still sensed something unusual in his seemingly frank words. He remained impassive. He said he hadn't threatened them to that extent yet. Julian replied that nipping things in the bud was the path to longevity. His prowess was revealed in the autumn exercises. Pretending nothing had happened was just burying his head in the sand. Caleb suddenly asked who his friend was. Julian smiled at him. He asked if Caleb would dare to believe him if he told him the truth. Caleb stared at Julian, agitated. He didn't believe him. Julian was a master of seduction. Every word he spoke when he was lucid was a mix of truth and lies. This man was too difficult to handle. Caleb even felt he was easier to talk to in bed. He leaned closer. He said he would find out. As long as Julian left a trace, he wouldn't escape his sight. Julian was delighted. He told him he would soon have his own hands full and should first think about how to get through this safely. Caleb's serious expression suddenly changed. He said that Julian didn't seem to feel any sympathy at all. A night of passion should lead to 100 days of grace. He was too cold. Julian echoed Caleb's earlier words. He agreed, asking what he was going to do about it. Caleb sat back, propped his leg up again, and rested his arm on the back of the chair. He thought for a moment. He said the matter was easy to solve, not a big deal at all. For his reminder tonight, he had to thank him properly. Julian replied that he was too kind, but that it was surely worth 100 silver pieces. Caleb drew out his words. No money. He complained that his annual salary as a high-ranking official was only 150 pieces. But what he lacked in money, he could make up for in other ways. He offered to warm Julian's bed. Julian gave a polite smile. He declined, saying he was used to sleeping alone and didn't need a bed warmer. Caleb raised a finger to his nose and sniffed, his eyes playful as he looked sideways. He said that habits could be changed, and asked if Julian was still getting used to the scent of his handkerchief. Julian, caught off guard, dug his nails into his palm, leaving red marks. Caleb studied the beauty under the lamplight, watching him struggle to maintain his composure, watching the red marks on his fingertips. Finally, he pointed to his own earlobe and said in a wicked voice, "Lanshow, you're blushing." The blush. Julian's heart, which had been as still as a deep pool, now rippled at those words. The handkerchief in his sleeve felt like a burning coal. Some mischievous part of him had obeyed Caleb's command and sent the fire creeping up to his ears. He knew the spot of red would be glaring against his pale skin, and any denial would be unconvincing. He felt trapped by Caleb in some kind of predicament, surrounded by clear, bright mirrors. Caleb's gaze demanded he reveal his true form, demanded he surrender his armor. Julian licked his dry lips. He curled his fingers, not giving Caleb another chance to see, and ignored the teasing. He said it was time to sleep and that they should call for the others. Caleb found Julian's ignore you reaction to be an alluring scratch, making him want to press his advantage. But victory could not be rushed. Haste could lead to a trap. So he let it go this time. He said the masters had their own arrangements and there was no need to worry. If Julian wanted to sleep, the East Wing had been prepared. Julian stood up decisively. Javier and Croft were thoroughly drunk and didn't sober up until the next day. Julian loaded Javier into a carriage and took him back. Caleb watched the carriage disappear, then said to Corey, "For the next 2 days, keep a close eye on the 8 families. See who's making moves." Corey acknowledged the order. Inside the swaying carriage, Julian closed his eyes to rest. The carriage took a roundabout route, switching to an inconspicuous smaller vehicle midway before reaching the old chapel. Joel was carrying Javier on his back, following Julian into the courtyard. Grant had been waiting for a long time and came out to greet them. Julian reassured him that his master was just drunk. Professor Quinn was standing under the eaves. He told Grant to help Javier inside and let him sleep it off. Grant took Javier and carried him into the house. Joel took a few steps forward and knelt in the snow. He asked if the professor had been well. Quinn folded his hands and said that seeing him made everything better. He told him that he now went by the name Joel, and the old indenture contract was useless. But he was grateful that Joel was willing to stay out of a sense of loyalty. Joel's usual playful demeanor was gone. He said that what was a small favor for the professor was a life-saving grace for him. He recounted how, during the previous emperor's purge of corrupt officials, his father and brother were framed. If not for the professor's keen investigation and intervention, 20 members of the Chow family would have died unjustly. Quinn replied that his father and brother were honest and upright officials who were temporarily wronged. They would have been fine even without him. Joel paused for a long time. He said that the Chow family had failed to repay the professor's kindness. Years ago, Joel's father was still in the Department of Defense. When the emperor cracked down on corruption, his father was accused, and unaccounted for property was found under his name. When all seemed lost, it was Quinn who re-examined the case and exonerated him and several others. Because of this, Quinn betrothed his daughter to Joel's older brother. But that was not the end. A few years later, the crown prince was framed. Quinn was demoted from grand tutor to a commoner. As he retreated to the chapel with the prince, Joel's father switched his allegiance to the Empress Dowager. With the prince's fall, the Dowager used Pan Rugi's authority to purge the prince's remaining followers. Joel's father was imprisoned again. This time, without Quinn to protect him, both he and his eldest son were executed. The rest of the Chow family was exiled to Skylock Pass. Quinn's daughter, Joel's sister-in-law, died on the journey. Quinn pulled at his gray hair. He told him not to speak of the past. He said it wasn't easy for him to escape his former status, and he needed to think clearly now. Once he committed to Julian, he would be bound for life, his life and death no longer his own. Joel's hair blew in the wind, his smile roguish and free. He told the professor that he had no home to return to. He had been indebted to him and his sister-in-law his whole life, a debt he could never repay. Now that he was needed, his life belonged to his master. The old Joel had died with his sister-in-law on the road. Today's Joel was a blade. A blade has no life or death, no freedom. Since the sky was dark and the road difficult, he told him to draw him, this blade, and use him as he saw fit. Quinn stepped forward, leaning against a pillar. He looked at Julian. He said that another year was passing, and he had yet to give him his coming-of-age ceremony. Julian's sleeves billowed in the wind. He seemed to understand. Quinn said that Julian could now stand on his own, but the road ahead was long. Avenging his old grudge, dismantling the 8 gates, reopening old cases, bringing justice to the Central Plains. None of it would be easy. Javier wanted to give him a blade, and he wanted to give him one too. He told him to accept it. Fine snow began to fall in the courtyard. Julian lowered his head, and Quinn's cold hand rested on his hair. At dinner, Javier finally woke up. He had some porridge and then called Julian into his room. He asked if he remembered the blade he had mentioned. It had arrived the night before. He had been thinking about it. Javier moved a cabinet, revealing a sword rack behind it. The first time Julian saw the blade, he was captivated. He couldn't look away. Javier, holding a clean cloth, slowly wiped along the edge. He said that Gile couldn't wield it, but it was perfect for Julian. He had had the scabbard reforged, so its old name was no longer fitting. Julian would have to name it himself. Julian was still mesmerized by the blade's luster, studying it intently. Its nearly 3'7" straight blade meant it had to be drawn with incredible speed. Its 2-finger width made it perfect for thrusting. The hilt was also newly made of sandalwood, without any carvings, only capped with gold at the end and inlaid with a single white pearl. This was a masterpiece forged through countless hours of labor. After being hidden away for so long, it still radiated a murderous aura, like the still water of late autumn, not only spotless but also proud and solitary. Javier said he had been pondering something lately and had a realization last night when he saw Caleb. He had been too rigid in his teaching, which had somewhat constrained Julian. He put down the cloth. He told him that with this blade, not even Caleb's wolf blade could match the speed of his draw. The sandalwood hilt was light enough to allow for greater agility. In all martial arts, speed was paramount. This was his father's beloved blade. Although they now said the G family style was about brute force, the internal methods were created by his father. What suited him would surely suit Julian. He could forge his own path. Julian gripped the hilt and lifted it. Javier stepped back. He told him to give it a name. Julian, unable to part with it, asked if his master was really giving it to him. Javier laughed. He said he preferred his fists and had no use for a blade. It would be a waste if it wasn't given to him. Julian thought for a moment. He said he would call it Mountain Snow. That evening, Professor Quinn sat across from him, writing the surnames of the 8 families on a piece of paper. He said that the state banquet was approaching. The 4 great generals would be reunited, and local officials would be returning. With the new emperor on the throne, there would certainly be a grand inspection next year. This was a crucial event that would determine the political landscape for the coming year. The banquet and the holidays were a time for everyone to reassess the political situation. If the Dowager wanted to make a comeback, she would not miss this opportunity. After Floris's death, the Dowager had been confined to the palace and had not made any public appearances. The Floris family members were all demoted and exiled. If she wanted to make a move now, she would need external support. Julian frowned. He asked who would dare to ally with the Dowager after what happened to Shiguin. Quinn replied that cowards could not accomplish great things. Alliances were driven by self-interest. As long as the Dowager still had something to offer, she would not lack for new allies. He drew a few lines under the Floris family name. He said that besides, the men of her family were useless. He reminded Julian that the one she had been personally grooming was a woman. Julian said he was referring to the 3rd Floris daughter, Hua Xiangyi. Under the late emperor's favor, she was supposed to be named a princess. Quinn said that she never became one, not because the emperor was stingy, but because the Dowager forbade it. Julian took a sip of tea, thought for a moment, then swallowed. He said he understood. Quinn asked him to explain. Julian, leaning on his knee, said that if she had become a princess, her marriage would no longer be in the Dowager's hands. A princess's marriage was a matter of state, decided by the emperor and his ministers. But as just the 3rd Floris daughter, her future husband could only be chosen by the Dowager. So, Quinn asked, was the Dowager planning to marry her off? Quinn dipped his brush in ink. He said that if the mountain will not come to me, I must go to the mountain. The Dowager had sacrificed a pawn to save the king, losing Shiguin and her military control over the capital. But if Hua Xiangyi married Caleb Shaw, the problem would be solved. Julian's teacup clinked softly. He held it, his eyes lowered. He said that would be harder than climbing to the sky. Caleb would never hand over his power. Quinn suggested, with a hint of implication, that Hua Xiangyi was said to be a peerless beauty, and Caleb might be swayed by her charms. Julian sipped his tea, silent. Quinn admitted it was a difficult proposition. Even if Caleb was interested, his older brother would never allow it. They were mortal enemies with the Floris family. There was no reason for them to make peace when they had the upper hand. Julian thought for a moment. He said that if they couldn't get military power, controlling a key position in the central government was also a good option. But there were few rising stars now. The cabinet was still led by Henry Sterling. The Dowager couldn't possibly stoop to making Hua Xiangyi a concubine. In that case, there was no suitable candidate in the entire capital. Quinn wrote 2 words, the East. He said that if the Northlands were not an option, there was still a chance in the East. Julian noted that both General Thorne and Luke Grant were unmarried, so it had to be Grant. But the Grant and Shaw families were old allies. Their relationship couldn't be broken so easily. Quinn asked why he didn't guess the Thorne family. He said that besides Becca Thorne, there were plenty of other men in the family. Julian looked surprised. He said, "Surely not." A few days later, Caleb accompanied President Lee out of the city to welcome the two generals from the east. Luke Grant rode back with him. On the way, he took off his helmet and asked if Caleb had heard the news that was spreading on his journey here. Before he could elaborate, Rebecca Thorne, riding up from behind, slapped him hard on the back. "General!" Grant yelped in pain. Thorne, looking unusually displeased, leaned over from her horse and asked Caleb when the rumors had started circulating in the capital. Caleb was even more confused. Thorne gritted her teeth. She said that someone wanted to be her new stepmother. Caleb was stunned. He asked if the old General Thorne was taking a new concubine. Thorne scoffed. "Concubine? The rumor is he's getting remarried." She spat that the third florist's daughter wanted to be her stepmother, and asked if the girl was even as old as she was. Hua Xiangyi was indeed not as old as Rebecca Thorne. She was 2 years younger. She had grown thinner during her time in the palace. She saw the portrait of General Thorne on the dowager's desk and understood. The dowager took her hand and held it for a long time. She said that an old husband with a young wife, Qi Shiyu, would still know how to dote on a person. Hua Xiangyi, dressed in a purple palace gown, rested her head on the dowager's lap. The dowager stroked her long hair. She told her not to feel wronged, that this was how the florist women had always been married off. If she married him in a few years, she would be the true mistress of the 5 eastern commanderies. Incense burned in the hall. A servant silently gestured for the other attendants to leave. Hua Xiangyi smiled. She said she would miss her aunt. The eastern coast was so far away, it would be a year before she could see her again. The dowager said she would miss her too. She held her gently, and Hua Xiangyi snuggled against her like she did as a child. The dowager recalled how she had been only 15 when she married the emperor. That year, leaving her hometown, the thing she missed most was the swing in her family's garden. She used to love to sit on it and listen to the sounds of the world outside the high walls. Her mother had comforted her, saying that in the imperial palace in the capital, the emperor would build her an identical one if she wished. Hua Xiangyi remained quiet. The dowager was the beloved consort of her time, but what the emperor gave her was not what she wanted. Once she entered the capital, she realized that a husband's affection was as fleeting as a cloud. She had to constantly compete with countless other women for a moment of his favor. In the capital, love was the cheapest commodity. The dowager patted Hua Xiangyi's head. She said it had been 37 years in the blink of an eye since she came here. Now, her little girl was getting married too. She was truly old. She reflected that in the capital, she saw that the world belonged to men because they could become officials and generals. Women were confined to their quarters, taught virtues, and no matter how intelligent or eager to learn, they had to marry. The dowager's eyes were calm. Her father had taught her that he and the emperor were her sky. How absurd. When she became empress, she shared the world with the emperor. Who could be her sky? No one could. The men in her family were all incompetent. The florist family could only maintain its status by marrying off its daughters, generation after generation, without a word of complaint. What kind of family was that? If the world was to be judged by strength, then she too could win. The dowager stroked Hua Xiangyi's hair. She told her to remember that this time, it was not Qi Shiyu who chose her, but she who chose him. She might be defeated one day, but not now. Her little girl was going to the east not out of helplessness, but to build for the future. No matter what happened, she could sigh, but she must never pity herself. In this game of chess, once a move is made, there is no regret. Since they were surrounded by wolves with no escape, they had to fight to the death. The bamboo chimes in the hall swayed gently. Hua Xiangyi slowly took the dowager's hand in her own. She vowed she would never forget her aunt's teachings. The state banquet was held on the night of the Spring Festival. Local officials had been arriving in the capital. This year, there were far fewer private banquets. Everyone knew Henry Sterling was watching closely, and any gathering could be seen as evidence of factionalism. President Li had not been in power for long, and everyone wanted to use the banquet to observe their new leader. The political climate in the capital was still uncertain, and everyone was cautious. Only the matter of the third florist's daughter was being talked about more and more, leaving Rebecca Thorne with no outlet for her frustration. Caleb had been secretly investigating the 8 families, but this matter had also piqued his interest. Just as his older brother arrived in the capital, the two of them were discussing it in their residence. Caleb was looking over the Northlands Cavalry's expense report for the year. He said casually that the Flores family wanted to rise from the ashes, but no matter how lecherous old General Thorne was, he couldn't agree to this marriage. His brother, seated at the desk reviewing military documents, replied that it was hard to say. Caleb looked up. He asked what benefit it would bring to the East. His brother, marking a document, asked if Caleb, now in charge of the 8 divisions in the capital, had ever looked at their accounts. Caleb replied that the Department of Justice had shown him the books during their audit. The surplus money and grain from the 8 divisions had been reallocated to the FSS this year. He asked what was wrong. His brother looked at the document, thinking for a moment. He said that when Flores was still alive, the annual budget for the 8 divisions was several times that of the entire border region.